Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to share my fiction favorites of 2023. So I read some absolutely fantastic fiction titles in 2023, which always makes making a favorite list so difficult. But after much deliberation and humming and hawing over the exact placement of the books on this list, I have finally come up with a list of 10 of my favorite fiction books of 2023. I have also done a non-fiction favorite where I share my 3 top non-fiction reads of 2023. That video came out a few days before this one, so if you want to go check out my non-fiction favorites, I will link that video. But in this video, we're just going to be talking about my fiction favorites. And as usual for my reading tastes, this list is skewing very heavily towards historical fiction and classics. In fact, it's made up entirely of historical fiction and classics. Those are just the books that I enjoy reading the most, and those were my best books of 2023. So starting off at the bottom of my favorites, number 10, and moving up all the way to number 1, my best book of 2023. At number 10, we have Murder in the Vatican, The Church Mysteries of Sherlock Holmes by Margaret Lewis. This is a thoroughly enjoyable book of Catholic-inspired Sherlock Holmes spin-off stories that are primarily set in the Vatican and are all inspired by references to different mysteries that weren't ever elaborated on in the canon, but were made reference to in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories. So this book contains 3 different mysteries. We have the death of Cardinal Tosca, the Vatican cameos, and the second Coptic patriarch. And so the author has put at the beginning the quote from the canon that she is elaborating on to develop this story. So for the death of Cardinal Tosca in The Adventure of Black Peter, it was said, "In this memorable year 95, a curious and incongruous succession of cases had engaged his attentions, ranging from his famous investigation of the sudden death of Cardinal Tosca, an inquiry which was carried out by him at the express desire of His Holiness the Pope." And then for the Vatican cameos, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, the reference was, "I was exceedingly preoccupied by that little affair of the Vatican cameos, and in my anxiety to oblige the Pope, I lost touch with several interesting English cases." And then for the second Coptic patriarch, the quote comes from the retired colorman, "You know that I am preoccupied with this case of the 2 Coptic patriarchs, which should come to a head today." So I love that even though these are obviously not canon stories, that the author has pulled out elements of the canon to base her stories on. This book features Pope Leo XIII, as well as G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown as side characters and sleuthing companions. After having so much success with Jane Austen retellings recently, I wanted to experiment with Holmes retellings, and I couldn't have picked a better book for my first foray into this world because the writing style in this book felt very, very true to Doyle. I am definitely hoping to branch into more Sherlock Holmes retellings in 2024, and maybe I'll be able to do a video like I did ranking my favorite Pride and Prejudice retellings once I have more Sherlock spin-offs under my belt. Book number 9 is Illuminations by Mary Sharratt. This book was on my 5-star historical fiction prediction list, and thankfully it really lived up to the hype that I had created for it in my mind. As an aside, I only have one more book to read on that 5-star historical fiction prediction list, and then I'll be able to do a reaction video sharing my thoughts on each of those books, as well as I'm planning to do another video with an entirely new 5-star historical fiction prediction list for 2024. When I picked up Illuminations, it had been a few months since I had read a really solid 5-star historical fiction book, and this story reminded me exactly why I love the genre of historical fiction so much. Set in Germany in the 11th and 12th century, we are following the story of St. Hildegard of Bingen, from her childhood when she is enclosed as an anchoress as a young child around 8 years old, through finding her passions in life for reading and writing theology books, composing music, and studying herbology, all the way up into her later years when she finally became prioress of her own monastery. I learned a lot about Hildegard's life through reading this book and came away with an even greater appreciation for this incredible doctor of the church. Book number 8 is We Must Not Think of Ourselves by Lauren Grodstein. This is a book that I actually received as an e-arc from NetGalley from the publisher, which is Algonquin Books. So I'm grateful that I was able to read this book for free ahead of its publication in exchange for providing an unbiased review. And thankfully it was a book that I really, really loved and ended up here on my favorites list of the year. We Must Not Think of Ourselves is telling the story of the Warsaw Ghetto as seen through the eyes of a young widower named Adam Pascoe. He was an English teacher before the war and is continuing to teach English lessons to children in the ghetto when he is approached about joining a secret archival project that is codenamed Oneg Shabbat. As the book unfolds, we learn not just about Adam's life, but through the interviews that he collects for this archive, from his friends and neighbors in the ghetto, we learn about their lives both before and during the war. I found this book especially fascinating because it is based on a true story that I wasn't aware of, which is the fact that there was this archival project going on in the Warsaw Ghetto. A group of people who wanted to preserve and collect documentation about what daily life was like for the Jewish people who were living there. As someone who loves spending time in archives, and as a family historian that relies on the record keepers of previous generations to piece together my own family's story, I have so much admiration and respect for the bravery shown by these individuals who were passionate about preserving their community's stories, knowing that they would likely not live long enough to be able to tell the stories themselves. In doing some of my own research after finishing this book, I found out that of the 3 archive capsules that were buried in the ghetto during the war, only 2 have ever been recovered. So there is still out there a 3rd capsule of these archival documents that has not yet seen the light of day. In addition to the fast-paced and gripping plots, the writing in this book is very poignant and beautiful, and there were many passages that I highlighted that really stood out to me. And I appreciate that this book brought kind of a new perspective and some new context to a subgenre of historical fiction that I feel can be kind of oversaturated at times. Book number 7 is The Solitary Summer by Elizabeth von Arnim. This book was utterly enchanting, and I am so glad that I have discovered von Arnim because I just love her writing so much. There were breathtakingly beautiful descriptions of nature combined with witty, laugh-out-loud funny social commentary. This is the 3rd von Arnim that I have read, and at this point she has firmly enshrined herself as one of my very favorite classics authors. The Solitary Summer is the 2nd in her loosely veiled semi-autobiographical series of Elizabeth books that chronicle her time living with her husband and her children on his ancestral estate in Germany. This book is told in diary format and tells the events of a single summer from May to October, where Elizabeth decides that she is not going to entertain any visitors because she doesn't want anything to disturb them from having a peaceful, solitary summer. I find Elizabeth is such a bookish kindred spirit. There's one quote in particular that I had to include in this video because I just think so many of us here on Booktube could relate. It says, "And was there ever such a hopeful beginning to a day, and so full of promise for the subsequent right passing of its hours, as breakfast in the garden, alone with your teapot and your book?" So with a book full of passages like that, you can see that it is no wonder why it has ended up in spot number 7 on my favorites list of 2023. Book number 6 is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. I feel like there's not very much that I can say about this book without giving away what makes this book so brilliant, because the characters just continue to get more and more complex as the plot unfolds. This book had me absolutely reeling by the end, unsure of who I could trust, and feeling a little bit like I had been manipulated by one or more of the characters. Even all these months after finishing it, I'm still not sure who the true villain of the story was. Full of suspense and tension building, this is one of du Maurier's historical novels set during the Victorian period, with the action taking place both at an English country estate as well as a villa in Italy. Our narrator, Philip Ashley, was orphaned at a young age and taken in by a bachelor cousin, Ambrose, and once Philip has kind of come of age, Philip takes a trip to Europe to try to improve his rheumatism and ends up meeting a woman called Rachel in Italy and writing a letter back to Philip saying that he is married now and is going to stay in Italy with Rachel. And the plot really starts to unfold from there. If you have read and loved Rebecca but have never explored any of du Maurier's other writing, I would highly recommend picking up My Cousin Rachel. Okay, so we are entering into the top 5. And book number 5 is The Year in Between by Christina Moreland. This is kind of a huge book. I think it's like 600 plus pages, but I read it on ebook, so I wasn't aware of exactly how long it was until I went to mark the book as read in Goodreads, because it really didn't feel like a burdensome or laborsome reading experience. I just absolutely loved this book. I am going out on a limb and saying that this is my new all-time favorite Jane Austen retelling, and it is a retelling of Sense and Sensibility. So this is my first time branching out of the Pride and Prejudice realm in terms of Jane Austen spin-off fan fictions. But in addition to being a Jane Austen retelling, it's also a supremely satisfying historical fiction book in its own right. And I honestly don't think I'm ever going to be able to reread Sense and Sensibility without picking up The Year in Between immediately after, because it just completes the plot arc of Sense and Sensibility so beautifully. If, like me, you find the romantic relationships to be the weakest part of Sense and Sensibility, I really urge you to pick up this book, because it adds so much emotional depth both to Edward and Eleanor's marriage as well as Marianne and Colonel Brandon's courtship. Told in alternating chapters between the two sisters' viewpoints, it fills in all the details of that year that Austen skips over in the final chapters of Sense and Sensibility. I always come out of Sense and Sensibility loving Eleanor, but this book may have converted me into being a bit of a Marianne fan. So if you are a fan of Sense and Sensibility, I would highly encourage you to pick up The Year in Between, because it is just a brilliant continuation of the story of Sense and Sensibility, and I felt like it was very true to the characters and the plot threads that Austen had started in that novel. Book number 4 is another du Maurier, and that is The King's General by Daphne du Maurier. This was another 5-star du Maurier for me, and really solidified that her writing is just something magic for me. The King's General is honestly everything that I want a historical fiction novel to be. Set during the English Civil War, this book follows Honor Harris through tragedy and conflict as she tells her side of the story of her life and that of her lover, the King's General, and the royalist versus parliamentarian battles that he fought across Cornwall. This book had all of the key elements that I'm coming to expect when I pick up a du Maurier book: gorgeous descriptive writing, an immersive, almost claustrophobic setting, a plot that gripped me from the very first pages, gothic elements galore with an old mansion that is full of secrets, and a not-so-romantic, slightly dark romance. In reading more about du Maurier's motivations for writing this book, it was fascinating to learn that she wrote it during the Second World War while her own husband was serving in the military. Since living through the COVID pandemic, I have been increasingly interested in how people use and have used throughout history literature and storytelling, both as a form of escapism and as a way to work through and cope with current events, particularly by looking back at similar traumatic situations throughout history. At the height of the pandemic, I found myself wanting to read historical fiction set during other historical pandemics, just for the sheer comfort of knowing that other people had once lived through similar things and come out the other side. So I feel a little bit of kinship with du Maurier at the very height of the Second World War, choosing to envelop herself in the story of a woman also living through a similarly devastating war. I picked up The King's General in June as a bit of a birthday treat for myself, and I listened to the audiobook that is narrated by Juliet Stevenson, which made for a delightful reading experience despite the kind of dark and depressing content of this book. Coming in at number 3, I am cheating and putting 2 books, and that is The Story Girl and The Golden Road by Lucy Maud Montgomery. I'm counting this duology as a single book in my favorites list because the content and style of these two is quite similar. It really is a direct continuation of each other, and there is little between the two of them that would differentiate one as being a higher ranked favorite than the other. I think I would always want to read the two fairly close together because this duology really does make up the perfect encapsulation of the story of the King cousins. It's a little bit tragic that I'm just reading these two books for the first time now in my 30s, rather than as a Road to Avonlea obsessed preteen. Both of these books are absolutely charming novels, full of all the sentimentality and seasonality that I love in Montgomery's writing. Many of the anecdotes in both of these books were familiar to me from the first few seasons of the Road to Avonlea TV series, because these are the books that they are primarily based on, although they draw on other pieces of Montgomery's work to fill in other plot points as well. So because I was and am such a Road to Avonlea fan, reading these books felt nostalgic even though I was picking them up for the first time. The Golden Road was my very last finish of 2023, and I'm just so glad that this past year I finally got to read these, because they are now up there with my very favorites of the Anne series as my most dear Montgomery novels. Book number 2, the penultimate book on my fiction favorites list and the ultimate runner-up, and it's a book that I am absolutely shocked is as high up on my favorites list as it has ended up being, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I participated in the Dracula Daily Read-Along this year, which read the entire book of Dracula from May to November, following along with each segment of this epistolary novel as they unfolded in real time. I really didn't know much about the plot of this book before going in, besides kind of the broad brushstrokes about Dracula's character that have made its way into modern vampire typology and lore. So I was really surprised by just how much I ended up loving the reading experience of this book. Because I was following along with the events of this book chronologically, I found myself thinking about these characters on a daily basis for months at a time, and worrying about them when a day's segment ended on a cliffhanger and we didn't get an update the next day, or even for weeks. I found that the horror elements in this book were not nearly as scary or gory as I had feared they might be, with most of it being just deliciously tense gothic atmosphere. The relationships in this book, both romantic and platonic, are so deeply felt and beautifully expressed in a way that is very affecting. I was also really surprised by just how much discussion of faith is woven in throughout this plot, particularly in the later portions of the book. It was really not something I was expecting to find in like a supernatural horror novel. If you have never read Dracula, I would highly recommend taking part in Dracula Daily in 2024, because it just made for a really unique reading experience of this well-known classic. And then, drumroll, we have reached my favorite book of 2023, and that is Anna Karenina by Lev Tolstoy. I feel like there is nothing that I could say that would do this book justice. When I finished this in mid-February, I had this feeling that even if I read nothing else for the rest of the year, I would still consider my reading year to have been a huge success just for having read this one single novel. I went into this book pretty intimidated by its lengthy page count, its status as a translated classic, as well as just its gargantuan reputation in the literary world. But I was pleasantly surprised by just how readable I found it and how quickly I came to care deeply for all of the characters. I listened to the Maggie Gyllenhaal narration on Audible, and I would highly recommend that if you are wanting to pick up Anna Karenina and aren't sure about a translation or audiobook that might be right for you. I'm not sure exactly which translation she was reading, but I found it very easy to understand and was not nearly as complex or difficult as I thought it might be. Finishing this book has given me so much confidence to move on to try other Russian and translated classics in 2024 and beyond. Written and set in mid-19th century Russia, this book tells the story of a few different high society families whose lives are interlinked and impacted when Anna Karenina begins to have an affair with a military officer. My favorite character in this book ended up being Levin, and I particularly enjoyed reading his musings about faith and his desire for a simple life with a wife in the countryside. While he may not be the titular character, I feel like he really was the true hero of the story. There are so many passages in this book that are just absolutely beautiful, and the characters and this story still roll around in my head as I have continued to mull over different aspects of the book's themes long after I actually finished the reading process. It's always a pleasure when one of the pillars of classic literature actually lives up to the hype when you finally get around to picking it up. And so I'm so glad that I loved the reading experience of Anna Karenina, and I love that I have finally read Anna Karenina in 2023. This is one of those classics that I have been aware of and wanting to read for ages and ages, and so it's just really felt like such an accomplishment to not just finish reading it, but to have thoroughly enjoyed it as well. So that is my list of my 10 favorite fiction books in 2023. I thoroughly enjoyed so many of the books that I read in 2023, and I'm looking forward to another great year of reading in 2024. I would love to know what some of your favorite fiction reads of 2023 were, and maybe I will have a chance to pick them up and also love them in the new year. Thanks for watching, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.